Welcome and Shana Tova. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu La'asok B'divrei Torah.
Hey.
And we are working on Ha'azinu, this great poem. Please God, we have today and tomorrow to proceed a little further. It's poetry, it's intense, lots of Rashis, and in fact, we'll take a look at how the Targum works as an interpretation of this text too. So, Yimtza-ehu. So this word matzah is actually means to find, but it does have other meanings that are clarified, as Rashi is going to do for us contextually. So we'll take a look at the Hebrew, and then of course I have a note here to look at the Targum, because this is a great example of how the Targum can sometimes function as an interpretation. So Yimtzaehu be'eretz midbar. So he found them in a desert area, in a land of wilderness. So provided for them makes a lot more sense, right? Although it could be understood that way in the sense that the Jewish people, became covenanted to God in the wilderness, right, in the Sinai. Uvetohu yelel yeshimon, and in the emptiness of a howling wasteland. That's quite poetic. Yesovavenu Yevonanehu, right? He encircled him, or he encircled them, Uvonanehu, and we're going to look at the Targum on this, because as I noticed here, right, that you have the root word bun and maybe bina, words like that, right? Although, again, I don't know that we could say it's rooted in the word bana, to build up. These words could all have some connection, although vun and vana are two unrelated roots, okay? Yitz renhu, he treasured him, something like that. Ke'eshon eno, like the pupil of his eye, right? Or he protected them, perhaps, again. So the word tsar, is that the word here? The nahu, you can see nahu. It's a poetic form of them, of a suffix meaning them. Okay, so let's take a look at the Targum here. Well, the best Aramaic I can come up with. Sapik sorkehon, which means he provided for their needs, quite literally, provided for their needs. Ba'ara, in the land, excuse me, madbara, you can see the cognate form, right, of a midbar, a wilderness. Uvet safchana, and a place of drought, right? Or perhaps here it means, let me think, whether this has a different meaning to it, and I didn't even think about that, right? Atar, a place, delate maya, where there was no water. So uveit, if we understand uveit as being the cognate of bayit, right, then it would be a place of drought, and atar does mean a place where there was no water. You can see it's not translating this literally here. Ashrinun schor, he caused them to dwell around about the Shchinte, his divine presence. Alefinun means he taught them. Pitgame oraita, the words of the Torah. Nitarinun, he guarded them. Kevavat einehon, like the pupil of his eyes. Okay, so there we are. We got the Targum giving an interpretation of the Hebrew here in the Torah. And now we'll take a look at Rashi, and you'll see how Rashi also uses the Targum to some extent as to his interpretation. And of course, we understand that Rashi gets so much of his interpretation from the Midrashim, from all these rabbinic sources, the Midrashim, the Talmud, and other places, the various Midrashim that exist. So, Yimtsaehu be'eretz midbar. So he translates it as this. Look at how he goes in a very different direction here. He says, Otam matzah lo ne'emanim. He found them, right? He found for him, ne'emanim, faithful. So he found them to be faithful, be'eretz midbar, in a land of wilderness, right, or desert. Shekiblu alehem torato umalchuto ve'ulo, because they accepted upon themselves his Torah, his teaching, his sovereignty, malchuto ve'ulo, and his yoke. Ma shelo asusa. Rashi's connecting this to the previous verse and making sense out of it from its connection to the previous verse where he talked about how God chose the descendants of Jacob and not the descendants of Ishmael or Esau. And he's going to play around with this, right? Ma shelo asu Yishmael ve'esav, something that Ishmael and Esau did not do. Emar, as it states, Lekaman Lamed Gimel, later on in chapter 33. V'zarach, this is from actually V'zot HaBracha, the final poem. We've got one more poem to go through, and that's the blessing with which Moses blesses Israel. This is from the beginning of that blessing. V'zarach mi Seir lamo, and he shone from Seir. Seir is the land of Esau, right? To them, Hofia Mehar Paran, and he appeared from Mount Paran, which is the location of Yishmael. And in the beginning of that poem, in V'zot HaBracha, he starts off with the midrash that is quite well known, I would say, how God offered the Torah to all the other people, and for whatever reason it was, they refused to accept the Torah, and when he offered it to the Jewish people, the Israelites, they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will perform it and we will understand it, and putting performance in before understanding. So that's how Rashi goes on this verse, differently from the Targum. Uvetohel yalel yeshimon, and in the emptiness of a howling desert or barren area, Eretz, he explains the Hebrew, Eretz tziyah ushmama, a place of drought, right? Ushmama, basically it means wilderness, something like that. Makom yilalat taninim, a place where jackals, uvenot ya'ana, or should I say, where jackals howl, and that's Yalel Yeshimon, uvenot ya'ana, and ostriches. Afsham, even there, nimshechu achar ha'emunah, they drew themselves after being faithful. V'lo amru leMoshe, and they didn't say to Moses, Hey ach neitzeh lamidbarot, how is it possible that you're taking us out of Egypt, understood, to these deserts, right, these wildernesses, makom tziyah, place of drought, ushemamun, and a waste area, meaning, of course, there were no towns there where they could satisfy and get provisions, etc. Ki inyan shene'emar, as it states, this is this beautiful passage from Jeremiah 2, chapter 2, Lechtech acharai, when you went after me, meaning God, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. So in that passage, Jeremiah is comparing the people of his day to the beginnings of the Jewish people. And we know this is essentially emphasizing the good element of the Jewish people. They also had their other moments, as you are now very well aware. Yesovavenhu, he surrounded them. So Rashi is, again, taking this in a little bit of a different place. Sham Sivavam, there, in other words, in this wilderness, he surrounded them. He found same idea, right? He brought around them and he encircled them, but ananim with clouds, usivavam bidgalim. He also surrounded them with flags, with banners, the arba ruchot, to the four directions, cardinal points. Usivavam, he keeps using this particular verb, right? The tachtit hahar, and he surrounded them at the base of the mountain, meaning Mount Sinai. This is also a midrash that is relatively well known. Shekafu alehem, he placed over them kegigit, the mountain. It's referring to the mountain like a tank, right? Like a water tank, something like that. And essentially, the midrash goes on to say, and insisted that they accepted the Sefer Torah, that they accepted the Torah, excuse me. In other words, there's that sense of how important it was from a divine perspective that they accept the Torah. So we have these balancing statements on the part of the Israelites that on the one hand, they did it willingly, and on the other hand, in a sense, God was saying, if you don't accept this Torah, the mountain's going to fall on top of you right now. So that's a very interesting midrash. You know, obviously the superficial way of saying it is that they were forced into submission there. Another way of looking at it is saying to them, know how the implications of what you're going to do. If you choose to reject the Torah, you know, it's going to hurt you terribly. And that is a good question. Yes, question or
I mean,
comment?
what I see in the Rashi is he's responding to, he encompassed them,
Right,
and that's why
right.
he's saying he either he could come at them all sides threateningly, like I'm going to drop this on you, but also you can come at all sides as in you're feeling God all around you in a way that makes you want to what God
That's very
says.
nice. Yeah, I never
Like
considered
a
that.
hug or like an
Yeah,
emotional hug, but something where
right.
you just have a sense of God, you know, and
Right. It would be a lovely way to understand it, Lauren, if the Midrash didn't go on to say, if you don't accept the Torah, these are going to be your graves. The Midrash is pretty clear about how significant it was for, and which is the point that I think the Midrash is trying to make. But I do love your interpretation, you know, because I think all the other interpretations are very consistent with how you're choosing to look at it, you know, as being a loving act. But it could also be, and I'm not entirely, you know, disagreeing that even this, in its own sense, can be a loving act. That when you reject the one who loves you so much, you hurt everyone involved. So
well, the image of the clouds also is like the image of the sukkah as
yes,
protecting
absolutely.
protection.
Right, absolutely, and that's stated explicitly later on, you know, in the Talmud and other midrashim. Yes, that is precisely one of the understandings of the Sukkah. They're described as ananei kavod, clouds of glory, but that word kavod actually denotes God's presence, the clouds of divine presence, and of course, Sukkot is just filled with that sense of divine presence. After we've cleansed ourselves through the Aseret Yemei Tshuva and Yom Kippur. So, Yevonanehu, here he goes more with the Targum. Rashi goes more with the Targum and understands this word as gave them understanding. Sham, there in the wilderness, the Torah uvina, through the Torah, divine instruction, uvina, and understanding. Yitzrenu, he guarded them. Minachash, saraf, v'akrav, he guarded them from serpents or fiery serpents, snakes, fiery serpents and scorpions. Umin ha'ovdei kochavim. And he also guarded them from idolaters who would have attacked them. Ki ishon eno. Again, Rashi now is taking into account this Hebrew here, which is not something common, right? And it says this ishon eno is hu hashachor sheba'ayin. This is the pupil, the dark place, the black part of the eye, shehamaor yotze hemenu, where the light goes out from it. So there was a theory of sight, which interestingly enough, instead of looking at the light coming into the eye, it had a theory that the light goes out of the eye to see what it's seeing. So for this theory of vision, and I am not giving you enough information as to how this theory actually worked. So I don't know if any of you have done a little bit more research on that, but at any rate, it's referring to the pupil of his eye.
I
Yeah.
just want to mention that my Rashi does not mention in the previous Rashi that you read, mine doesn't say anything about kochavim, doesn't use that phrase.
Oh, okay. Ovdei kochavim.
Yeah, mine doesn't.
Does it say Ovdei gilulim?
Nope. It doesn't
mention
even say
anything about
obey.
idolaters.
It doesn't say idolaters at all. It says snakes, serpents, scorpions, and then it's hard for me to read without the vowels, and
Yes.
but it's nachash, something like saraf or something, akrev, mean ha'omot, just from the nations.
Yes. So min ha'omot means the same idea. It just simply means from the nations. And it's possible, you have to understand, there were educated Jews who converted out of Judaism and very often set to work as censors. And they would censor these particular words. So Ovdei Kochavim is a little harsher than Umot, which just means the nations. And these are textual variants that are part of very serious and intense study of this material. And so there are texts nowadays very scholarly in the sense that they preserve textual variants, and there have been books written which give you the alternative, and this is called sort of critical texts. The Art Scroll edition that I'm reading of Midrash Rabbah on Kohelet has a column called Shinei Shinuyei Nuschaot, which means different versions of the text, and they list their alternative readings that are found in other manuscripts or early printed editions. It's such, you can see how deeply we can go into this. And right now I'm emphasizing more the horizontal motion through the Torah to give you a broader sense of what's going on, and not necessarily going into that kind of depth. There's just no end to it. And it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit as to how delightful this is, and how, frankly, if I weren't able to do this and weren't able to study Torah, my life would hardly be worth living. It is just something that the more you do it, and the more you get into it, and the more you appreciate it, the more it really, when you say Ki hem chayenu ve'orech yameinu, that's how Lisa beautifully sings this on Shabbat evening, how that's not just words. It is the truth. It is a deep truth. So,
quick question.
Yes.
If it's a long answer or a whole subject, we'll take it. We'll defer. But why were there censors? You were saying, yeah.
Okay, so because there was such competition between Christianity and Judaism at the time, remember, Jews were accused of being Christ killers and things like that, and so they really didn't want them to say some of the things they were saying within Judaism, because there were in fact statements made within these traditional texts, like here in Rashi, that they felt were insulting to Christianity. because
Oh.
there was the competition. It went both ways, and of course Christians were in the vast majority, and they rejected Judaism. And the New Testament, of course, in describing the Jewish people as being responsible for the crucifixion, we know how even to this day, to some extent, around Easter time, this was a time when they'd go out and kill Jews and persecute them. But there were also times when they simply tried to, make them subjugate them. And again, these censors were trying to prevent the study of Torah to whatever extent they felt, might be harmful to Christianity. At the beginning of this whole series, I mentioned why I thought Rashi actually wrote this. And my sense was that Rashi wrote it from a very practical concern that there were missionaries who were familiar with the Bible, familiar with the Torah, and would give Christological interpretations to these verses. And if Jews were unable to answer those things because they had no knowledge of scripture and things like that, they would be prey to the missionaries. And so one of the reasons he wrote this was to try and give them some information, some better understanding of their own scriptures. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully some of that competition is no longer out there, but the trouble is we still see anti-Semitism. We still see, sadly, Christian-based anti-Semitism. And you could say that some of the anti-Semitism in Germany at the time that allowed Hitler to do what he did was based on this deep reservoir of faith, of the Christian faith against Judaism. I will tell you that I believe part of what created the situation of Vatican II under Pope John the 23rd, where he did an incredible job of moving the church away from incipient anti-Semitism and moving it right away, I'm sure, was Pope John the 23rd's sense of how Christianity might have been a basis for Hitler's anti-Semitism, even though Hitler tried to base it on quote scientific evidence. He tried to do it, but it always coming from that piece. So,
and pagan versions of Nordic folk religious, separations and
So, okay. The Onkelos Tirgame, and Onkelos translated it, right? Yimtsaehu, that word Yimtsaehu, remember I told you, was somewhat ambiguous. Yas pi kehu, that's not ambiguous. That Aramaic means he provided them. Kol tzorcho, all his needs, bamidbar, in the wilderness. And then he gives examples of this word matzah, meaning to provide for them, right? So here in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, it says, umatzah lahem, meaning provided, would it provide them? They were actually, if we look at that particular verse, I believe the Israelites are complaining about a lack of food and stuff, and they're saying, even if God were to do this, would he actually be able to provide sufficient food for them? And then Yehoshua Yud Zayin, which is Joshua 17. By the time we get to chapter 17 in the book of Joshua, we're talking about the apportionment of the land of Israel to the various tribes. And this is the tribe of Ephraim. They came to Joshua and said, Lo, I believe, I'm going to think it could be Yimatzeh. I'm not certain. Without the vowels, it's hard.
Mine says Yimatzeh, you're correct.
It does say Yimatzeh, good. Very often what would tell me that is if there was another Yud there. That would let me know for sure that this is a Nifal form, that this is a passive voice, but Yimatzeh lanu hahar, that this mountain or this hill country will not be sufficient for our population. So they were complaining to Joshua about the fact that they hadn't received enough of a portion. It's a really interesting little section there where Joshua is speaking and having to deal with the Ephraimites. Yesovavenu, okay. Again, he's going to the Targum here. Ashri Nun. He encamped a schor around about the Shchinte, his divine presence. In other words, we're talking about the setup of the camp of Israel, how you had the Mishkan in the center, and how you had the various tribes on all four cardinal points. So he says here, Ohel Moed Ba'emtza, the tent of meeting was in the middle, the Arba'ah Degalim, the Arba Ruchot, and the four standards, banners for the four directions. And I'd like to stop here, take this here, move this over here, and with God's help tomorrow, we will go to the next verse. You can see how intense this is. So I'm going to stop the share, and lovely seeing all of you. David, is your hand still up by any chance? No, okay. Any comments before I stop the recording? Yes, please.
How come the tribes, the people, how long did it take from Egypt to Palestine, to Israel?
So we know that under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have taken that long. It might have taken a couple of months, perhaps. You know, they needed to get to Mount Sinai to accept the Torah and to receive the Torah because they needed a system of laws by which to govern themselves when they got to the land of Israel. But remember the story of the spies, of the 12 spies that Moses sent out, and they traveled the land for 40 days. At that point, they were ready to enter it. And remember that entire generation had to wander the desert now for close to 40 years in order for that generation that refused to go in, or didn't want to, or were too scared, didn't have the, the confidence in God, that God would see them through, for them to die off and a new generation to enter. So in actual fact, it took them another, close to another 40 years. So Moses, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you do the math, Moses was 120 when he died. So he was 80 years old when he took them out of the land of Egypt.
Oh, yeah, you can, right. What did they do?
Harlan, life begins at 80.
Or
if you're Abraham, it begins at 75. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did they do with their clothes? How did they change their clothes in the
They
desert?
didn't have to. There's a midrash that actually talks about how their clothes did not. In fact, I think the Torah itself says, that their clothes did not wear out.
Wow. That's
Lisa,
a miracle.
Well, it is. It's how God took care of them. Lisa, you were going to say something?
I said it was good to know that life can begin at 80. Thank you.
Yeah, I know.
Maybe 75.
Yeah.
But also about fabric.
Yes.
There is, I have quality clothes that I have worn for over 40 years.
Yeah.
On a regular basis.
Mm.
And so there had to be really good cloth made also.
Yes.
So, in either way, God's providing.
Right. The other explanation is that there was dew that allowed the cloth to retain its vitality, etc. But there really were even greater miracles that aren't explicable scientifically, I would say, in that, you had young children that were growing up. Once you get to a certain age, of course, you don't necessarily change all that much in terms of sizing, but really and truly, this is all part of an understanding of the miracles. And again, I think we need to look, the way I find it, a way to understand these things is to, again, look at it more from a literary point of view than a scientific historical point of view, right? That we are describing in literary ways the degree to which God cared for them through that process. So I'm going to stop the recording right here. Thank you, those who have been watching us.